Thirds are the most versatile double stop and compete with octaves for being the most important to practice. Let's learn how to master them. Now, why are thirds so useful? The main reason is because they force your hand to learn all of the basic finger patterns. Mastering all the basic finger patterns means much better intonation in everything that you play. Remember that good intonation is all about understanding the relationship between notes. Nothing teaches these relationships better than thirds. Now, just in case you don't know what finger patterns are, we're going to discuss them here briefly. But if you want a more in-depth understanding of what finger patterns are, I'm going to make a video about them soon, and I'll link it here. Finger patterns are essentially a quick way of conceptualizing the spacing in between notes. The four most basic finger patterns are 1, 2, 3, and 4. These are the only 4 finger patterns that you need to master to play all of your major thirds. When we get into minor scale thirds, there will be even more possibilities, but I would really focus mainly on the major thirds for a long period of time, and only move on to the minor ones once you've mastered them. Now, thirds are a little bit more challenging for the hand than I would say octaves or sixths are, so be sure that you're being very patient when you're doing the first stage of your double stops and playing the notes separately. The first quirk about thirds that you need to understand is that there are small thirds and large thirds. Small thirds are going to span the distance of a step and a half. 1/2 step, 1 whole step, 1.5 steps. That would be one of the small thirds, or it can be a large third, which spans the space of 2 whole steps. 1/2 step, 1 whole step, 1.5 steps, 2 whole steps. Then I'm just moving that finger straight over. But the spacing in between the first and the third finger is either going to be a step and a half or 2 whole steps. So for each third, you want to have a clear understanding, is the spacing between my fingers a step and a half, or is it 2 whole steps? It can be helpful in the initial stages to actually write this into your music and say, this is a small third, this is a big third, this is a small third, this is a big third. One other thing that can be useful is to write into your music where the half steps are, so you can watch out for those, and those will help to guide you. As with all of these double stops, we want to start on stage 1 where we're playing the notes separately, and then put them together. This will allow your brain to really process the notes individually and will make it easier to understand whether it's a small third or a large third. This sort of thinking in terms of small thirds and large thirds can get you pretty far, maybe even to stage 3 of the progression, where you're playing them as written pretty accurately. However, as we get faster with our thirds, we want to start thinking less in terms of small thirds and large thirds, and more in terms of finger patterns. And this was a huge secret for me. Thirds were a very difficult thing for me to master, and there was a period of time where I spent at least 30 minutes a day for a year working on thirds. One of the real keys that helped unlock my thirds was to start visualizing them in terms of finger patterns, rather than just thinking in terms of small third or big third. Finger patterns are a way of easily conceptualizing the spacing in between your fingers. In major scales, you'll only use 4 different finger patterns. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can organize them in your mind based on where the half step is. Is it in between the first and second fingers? Is it in between the second and third fingers? Is it in between the third or fourth fingers? Or are there whole steps in between every finger? Once you visualize your thirds in this way, you start realizing, wow, there are only actually ever 4 different finger patterns that I really need to master in order to be able to play my thirds in tune in major keys. Now, thinking in terms of finger patterns is also helpful, because the way that I set down my first and third finger third is going to be different depending on what chord comes after that. If I'm setting a small third with my first finger and third finger, and the next chord is a large third with a low 2, then my hand shape has to be actually quite different to reach that next chord than if the next chord were a high 2. So here's my hand shape for the number 2 finger pattern, and here's my hand shape for the number 1 finger pattern. Notice how the wrist came closer to my face and also came in a little bit, and I had to feel like I was reaching back for the second finger a little bit. Not only does it change the way that the hand is shaped for the 2 and the 4, but I also have to change my hand shape for the 1 and the 3. So I have to think ahead of time in order to help to shape my next chord. Whereas if I'm doing this pattern, my hand is in quite a bit of a different shape. So if you're just thinking in terms of small thirds versus large thirds, there's going to be a point where you hit this difficulty where after placing the 1 and the 3, you say, oh, my hand's not in the right position for the 2 and the 4, and you'll have to adjust, and that all takes time. So if you're trying to do fast third runs, like I was trying to do in high school playing Paganini 24, I bumped up against a lot of issues because I did not have that mentality of setting the whole hand frame. I want to give you some tools to be able to practice this concept of doing finger patterns. One way to do this is to try to get to the point where you can almost trill in between the 2 thirds. And as you're doing this, really try to keep your hand loose and flexible so that you can adjust your thumb, your wrist position, the height of your fingers. Find the position that's easiest for your hand to be able to access that finger pattern in that position. Once you find that position, the goal is then to get to that position from the previous third. So when I shift into it, I should already be in that sweet spot for accessing that finger pattern. In order to help you to do that, you can pretend like the first third is essentially like a double ghost note for the second chord. And then that forces me to put my hand to the right shape to be able to access the next chord. This was the big aha moment for me that opened up my thirds. I realized it's not because my hand is small or lacks flexibility, it's because I didn't fully understand what hand shape my hand had to get to in order to be able to access the third accurately. And this works for when you're shifting up as well as if you're shifting down. So if I was shifting down, it would look like this. Essentially, I'm using the 1 and 3 chord that is to come as a ghost note, and then I set the 2 and the 4 immediately when I get there. And then I do like to go on to the next chord immediately after, just to make sure that both were in tune when I set it. So this is a special way of practicing thirds. The 2 things that I would recommend to really focus on, finding the proper position for the thumb and wrist in order to be able to access a certain finger pattern. Once you've found that proper positioning for the thumb and the wrist and the fingers, then I would work on shifting into that position. And then, of course, you just have to master all 4 finger patterns. And when you break it down into those finger patterns, there are really only 4. And so it might seem daunting at first, but if you can figure out, okay, for finger pattern number 1, this is my hand shape. For finger pattern number 2, this is my hand shape. For finger pattern number 3, this is my hand shape. And for finger pattern number 4, this is my hand shape. My body knows what those hand shapes feel like by now, and so my thirds have gotten more accurate. In a practical sense, we get good at this by really practicing transitions, being able to trill between 1 and 3 and 2 and 4. Then I would work on shifting into that position.
Here's a clip of me practicing, trying to get to the point where I can trill one of these finger patterns. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things about how to practice this. For starters, just follow the normal double stop progression where you grab each note separately and then play them together. Then I would grab the bottom note and then play it as written. Once I have all 4 fingers on the string and in tune, I like to then adjust my thumb, wrist, elbow, and shoulder to find the most relaxed position for my body in this finger pattern. After doing that, I move into these groups of 3. These are essentially like using the practice tool rhythms for your double stops. This is forcing me to practice very quick transitions and to place the 2 fingers at exactly the same time. Then it's just a matter of speeding it up.
Next, I'd like to talk about shifting and the special challenges that come up when we're doing thirds. First of all, it's important that you understand the different types of shifts: old finger shifts, new finger shifts, and replacement shifts. So if you haven't already seen my shifting video, go ahead and check that out, because it'll be complicated to understand how these work without having that base knowledge first. As I said with our earlier octave video, we do want to make our shifts very, very obvious. And so I always want the ghost notes to be very audible. However, with thirds, this means that we're doing a lot of replacement shifts. This means that we're shifting from a higher number finger to a lower number finger. And when we do that kind of shift, we're using the new finger with the old bow. This is called a replacement shift. So if I'm making this transition, I want to make sure that I'm using that replacement shift so that I can use my ear to ensure that I never miss the shift. And anytime I'm shifting upwards from a higher number finger to a low number finger, that's the same thing. So essentially for every upward shift on thirds, I'm going to be using these replacement shifts. Now when we're transitioning between strings, you have a choice of whether to use an old finger shift or a replacement shift. This is the old finger shift, where I use that old first finger to shift to the new position. It's more comfortable to do it this way, but I would say that the replacement shift is a little bit cleaner. So what that would look like is I switch to the second finger, which is going to be my new finger. I shift it into the new position on the old bow, and then I switch to the new bow as soon as I arrive. This one's a little bit cleaner for our ears because our ears don't love to hear a higher pitch moving to a lower one. So this would be a higher pitch, skipping to a low pitch. It's just a little bit more apparent for our ears to hear that. Whereas with this other shift, I'm never going above this pitch. And so I don't hear a hop down, I just hear a movement up. Feel free to pick which one you prefer, but stick to it every single time that you have a shift like that. For every other situation, we want to be using an old finger shift, where we use the old bow and the old finger to shift. So from the top of the scale, I use the old finger and the old bow. I shift to the new position, and then I place the new finger and use the new bow. With mastering thirds, it's all about practicing these transitions. Oftentimes, the fastest way of getting to the point where you can play the whole scale of thirds beautifully is to really linger on the most difficult transitions and master those separately. Now that we've done the grunt work with these thirds, it's time to move on to possibly what is the most enjoyable double stop to practice, which is sixths. These fit most comfortably into the hand and resonate easily, but they also have a very unique trick to them that many people haven't heard of, so I'm excited to share it with you.